He was born an outcast, a boy marked by shame, yet he rose to command an army that moved like thunder across the land. Shaka Zulu rewrote the very meaning of war, turning spears into storms and warriors into shadows of death. Kingdoms knelt, enemies shattered, and fear became his throne. But in the silence behind his power, betrayal sharpened its blade. How does a legend so feared, so untouchable, fall not to an enemy's spear, but to the hands of his own blood? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. In the year 1787, on the rolling hills of southern Africa where the grasslands swayed like waves beneath the wind, a child was born who would one day shake the earth with his footsteps. His name was Shaka, son of Senzangakona, chief of the Zulu, and Nondi, a woman of deep spirit and unyielding pride. Yet from his first breath, the world did not embrace him with warmth. Shaka's birth carried whispers of shame. He was considered illegitimate, a child not born under the seal of accepted union. The other children mocked him with cruel words, calling him names that stung like thorns against bare skin. In a world where lineage meant power, Shaka and his mother walked a path of hardship. But Nondi's love was a shield, and her resilience became the fire that lit her son's heart. He grew not in luxury, but in struggle. His days were filled with hunger, and his nights with the silence of rejection. Where others had comfort, he had lessons carved into his spirit. When boys laughed at him, he learned endurance. When neighbors cast him aside, he learned independence. And when the world told him he was nothing, he began to dream of becoming everything. The young Shaka walked barefoot over rough ground, his skin toughened by both the earth and the ridicule he faced. Yet within him, a storm was gathering. Hardship became his teacher, and pain became his forge. Like iron thrust into flame, he was being shaped, not broken. What others thought would weaken him instead made his heart fierce, his mind sharp, and his spirit unbending. Thus, in the shadows of rejection, the first sparks of a warrior's fire began to glow. Shaka, the child they called unwanted, was quietly becoming the man who would be remembered across generations. For even in his boyhood, the soil beneath his feet seemed to know it was carrying the weight of destiny. Banished by circumstance, Shaka and his mother Nondi carried their burdens across the open plains, stepping away from the Zulu and into exile among the Mthethwa people. The journey was not only one of distance but of destiny. Though they were cast out, the soil of the Mthethwa land would nurture the roots of greatness. Among the Mthethwa, Shaka found both refuge and trial. He was no longer the mocked boy of his childhood but a youth growing tall and strong, with eyes that burned like coals and a will that refused to bend. It was here he came under the watchful gaze of Chief Dingiswayo, a leader known not only for his authority but also for his wisdom. Dingiswayo saw in Shaka what others had overlooked, a spark of brilliance waiting to be kindled. The Mthethwa military became Shaka's forge. He learned the art of discipline, how to march long distances without complaint, how to hold his spear until it felt like an extension of his own arm, how to move with the rhythm of the regiment until many men became as one. The battlefield was his classroom, and every lesson drew him closer to mastery. It was in these ranks that Shaka revealed his courage. In skirmishes, he did not shrink back. Instead, he surged forward, fearless, his body moving with the certainty of one who trusted both instinct and steel. Under Dingiswayo's guidance, Shaka was not only trained in the art of war but also in the subtleties of leadership. He learned when to be stern and when to be merciful, when to command and when to listen. Dingiswayo's mentorship was like a chisel against stone, shaping Shaka into more than a warrior, shaping him into a leader. Thus, from exile came empowerment. The boy once scorned was now rising as a man whose spirit could not be contained. In 1816, the winds of fate shifted once more. Word spread that Senzangakona, chief of the Zulu, had breathed his last. The clan he left behind was small, weakened, and divided, like a tree with branches bending in every direction. Among his sons, rivalry burned, each one eager to claim the seat of power. But beyond the horizon, another figure was waiting, sharpened by hardship and hardened by exile, Shaka. With the backing of Dingiswayo and the strength of the Mthethwa regiments, Shaka returned to his people not as the outcast child they once scorned, but as a seasoned warrior whose name was already spoken with respect. His presence was like the sudden rise of a storm, and those who had laughed at him in boyhood now felt the weight of his gaze. The struggle for succession was swift and decisive. Rivals who thought to challenge him soon found their strength crumbling before his will. Shaka's confidence was not the arrogance of chance but the certainty of preparation. Years of discipline under Dingiswayo's mentorship had made him a strategist, a commander, and a man whose voice carried the authority of destiny. With Dingiswayo's support, Shaka seized the moment. He cut through the rival claims, not with reckless bloodshed but with the force of order and determination. The Zulu, long a small and scattered clan, now looked upon him as their leader. What had begun in shame and exile had risen to the height of recognition. Shaka stood as chief of the Zulu. It was more than a victory of bloodlines, it was the crowning of resilience. The boy mocked for his birth had become the man chosen by fate. And as he took the mantle of leadership, the earth itself seemed to tremble, for a new chapter had opened, one where the Zulu would no longer be a minor name whispered in the valleys, but a nation whose roar would echo across the hills of southern Africa. When Shaka took the reins of power, the Zulu were but a small flame flickering in the winds of stronger clans. Yet in his vision, that flame would become a wildfire. Between 1816 and 1818, he began the work of forging not just a clan, but a kingdom that would bind scattered peoples into one heartbeat, one voice, one power. The first task was unity. Neighboring clans, once divided by old quarrels and fragile ties, were drawn into the Zulu fold. Some came willingly, swayed by Shaka's promise of protection and strength, others were compelled through the force of arms. Where there had been fragments, Shaka wove a single fabric, each thread tied to the other until loyalty was no longer to a family chief but to the Zulu nation itself. To shape this new kingdom, Shaka built his army into an unbreakable machine. He organized warriors into regiments, known as Amabutho, grouping them by age and binding them with discipline. Each regiment was like a sharpened spear, trained together, marched together, fought together, and lived together. They were no longer just men, they were instruments of the king's will. Discipline became the marrow of the Zulu state. Warriors were forbidden from wearing sandals, their feet hardened against the earth through long marches. Spears and shields were kept at the ready, for no man was allowed to be caught unprepared. Loyalty was demanded not only in word but in deed. Obedience was the iron law that bound every soldier to his regiment and every regiment to Shaka himself. Through this system, Shaka laid the foundation of a centralized state. Chiefs who once ruled freely now owed allegiance to him, their power absorbed into his throne. Messages spread swiftly, decisions were enforced, and order flowed like a river from the top down. What had once been a scattered clan was now becoming a kingdom with a single center, a single purpose, and a single ruler. Thus, in the span of just a few years, the Zulu were reborn. Shaka's kingdom was not built of stone or gold, but of men shaped into living walls, spears turned into pillars, and discipline forged into mortar. The foundation was set, and upon it, the rise of the Zulu Empire would soon tower like a mountain above the plains. In the hands of Shaka, war was no longer a clash of chance but a craft reshaped by genius. He looked upon the old ways and found them wanting. Where others threw long spears from a distance, he saw waste. To him, true battle was not fought from afar but settled face to face, where courage could not hide behind flight. Thus he introduced the short stabbing spear, the ikla, named for the sound it made when pulled from a man's chest. Its blade was broad, its handle strong, made for close combat where the warrior's heart was tested. With this weapon, the Zulu no longer fought like hunters casting at prey, they fought like lions closing in for the kill. But weapons alone do not win wars. Shaka's mind carved new paths for battle itself. He shaped his regiments into a living beast, teaching them the bullhorn formation. The chest of the bull was the heart of the army, striking the enemy head-on with unyielding force. The horns swept wide, curling around to encircle and crush from the sides, while the loins, the reserve, waited to strike when the foe was weakest. It was not just war, it was choreography, a deadly dance where every step was planned, every movement bound to victory. To wield these tactics, Shaka demanded bodies as unyielding as iron. His warriors marched barefoot across thorns and stone until their feet grew hard as leather. They trained under sun and rain, running great distances with neither pause nor complaint. Each man carried his shield and ikla as though they were part of his very flesh. Cowardice was scorned, discipline was law, and loyalty to the regiment was as binding as blood. Through these innovations, the face of battle in southern Africa was transformed. Enemies who once fought in scattered lines were shattered by the precision of Zulu ranks. Clans that once resisted were swept aside by the storm of organized might. Shaka's warriors became more than men, they were thunder given form, a force that rolled across the land leaving fear in its wake and respect in its echo. From 1818 onward, the earth trembled beneath the march of the Zulu. What had begun as a small clan now surged like a tide, sweeping across the lands of southern Africa. Shaka, with his sharpened regiments and iron discipline, turned his gaze outward. Rival chiefs who once mocked the Zulu now faced the storm of his ambition, and one by one, their banners fell before his spears. The campaigns were fierce, yet swift. Villages that resisted were broken by the horns of his army, encircled and scattered like dry leaves in a gale. Those who yielded were drawn into the Zulu fold, their warriors reshaped by discipline, their loyalty bound to the throne. In every conquest, Shaka offered a choice: resist and be crushed, or unite and share in the power of a rising kingdom. With each victory, the Zulu grew larger than any clan had dreamed. From the rolling hills of KwaZulu to the wide plains beyond, Shaka's authority spread. Roads once lonely now echoed with the tramp of regiments, rivers once quiet now reflected the shields of countless warriors. The stories of these campaigns were carried on the wind. Some spoke of Shaka's fearlessness, how he stood tall in the thick of battle, his spear flashing like lightning. Others whispered of the dread his name inspired, for to face the Zulu was to stand against a storm without shelter. But these victories carried with them a shadow. The conquered who fled spread across the land, seeking refuge in distant valleys and mountains. Kingdoms once stable were shaken, new alliances forged in desperation, and wandering groups carved out fresh territories far from Shaka's reach. This great scattering, known as the Mefeking, began to reshape the very map of southern Africa. The Mefeking, the scattering, was not just a chapter of conquest, but a storm that tore apart the old order and rebuilt the land in new and unimagined ways. Villages uprooted by Zulu campaigns fled into distant territories, their people carrying stories of fear and survival. Some sought safety in the mountains, others crossed rivers and plains, while many wandered until they carved new homes in lands far from their birthplaces. In every direction, streams of humanity flowed, reshaping the face of the region. From this movement rose new powers. Displaced leaders gathered their followers and forged fresh kingdoms on foreign soil. The Sotho under Moshoeshoe rose in the mountains of what would later be called Lesotho, binding together scattered peoples through wisdom and diplomacy. Far north, Mzilikazi, once a general under Shaka, broke away to form the Ndebele Kingdom, carrying with him the fire of Zulu training into new lands. Each new state was both a child of the scattering and a rival in the making. The political map of southern Africa shifted like sand in the wind. Where once small clans stood alone, larger nations now emerged, drawn together by necessity or driven apart by fear. Old alliances collapsed, new borders hardened, and the land became a chessboard upon which Shaka's storm had scattered the pieces. Yet amid this upheaval, one truth could not be denied: the pulse of change beat to the rhythm of the Zulu drum. Shaka's campaigns had not only expanded his own kingdom but had also forced an entire region to reimagine itself. In war, he was a conqueror; in consequence, he was a reshaper of nations. The Mefeking was both destruction and creation, scattering lives yet giving birth to new histories. And though many cursed its hardships, others found in its wake the chance to rise, to lead, and to build kingdoms of their own. Thus Shaka's storm became more than his story, it became the story of a continent in motion. Under Shaka's reign, the Zulu Kingdom moved to the rhythm of his will. His rule was like the steady beat of a war drum, firm, unyielding, and impossible to ignore. Discipline was the marrow of his throne, and order the breath of his authority. Every man, woman, and child lived within a system shaped by his hand, where loyalty was not requested but required. Shaka ruled with absolute power, his word carrying the weight of law. Chiefs who once acted freely now bent their knees, their authority drawn into his circle. He demanded not just obedience but excellence. Warriors were his pride and backbone, and he managed them with a strictness that turned individuals into regiments, and regiments into an unstoppable force. His soldiers lived together in military barracks called amakanda, where age groups trained, ate, and slept side by side. For his subjects, life was one of structure and service. Tribute flowed to the king, whether in cattle, grain, or labor. By the mid-1820s, the horizon of the Zulu Kingdom stretched not only across the hills and valleys of the south but also toward the distant seas. It was at Port Natal, along the shimmering coastline, that Shaka and his people first came into contact with Europeans. They arrived in ships that glided across the water like giant birds, carrying the Europeans, strange tongues, and goods unlike anything the Zulu had ever known. They brought muskets, cloth, beads, and iron tools. In return, they sought ivory, hides, and the chance to trade with the powerful king whose fame had already reached their ears. To the Europeans, Shaka was a figure both feared and admired, the master of a vast army, a ruler whose word carried the weight of thunder. To Shaka, they were outsiders, curious and useful, but never to be trusted fully. Trade was allowed, but only on his terms. Cattle remained the heart of the Zulu economy, yet Shaka welcomed goods that could strengthen his kingdom. Muskets fascinated his people, but Shaka himself was not dazzled. He saw clearly that guns were slow, clumsy, and unreliable compared to the speed and precision of his Ikla and disciplined regiments. Still, he permitted exchanges, for he understood that every resource had its place in the great game of power. Diplomacy became another weapon in his arsenal. Shaka received the Europeans with dignity, granting them land at Port Natal while ensuring they remained within the shadow of his authority. They could live, trade, and build, but never forget whose land they stood upon. Stories spread of how he entertained envoys with great feasts, spoke with the confidence of a king, and reminded them that while their ships ruled the seas, it was he who ruled the earth beneath their feet. Shaka's view of foreigners was pragmatic. He was open to what strengthened his kingdom but wary of dependence. To him, the Zulu needed no saviors from across the ocean. They were already a people carved from discipline and bound by pride. The Europeans were tolerated guests, not masters allowed to trade and live so long as they understood the boundaries set by the warrior king. In 1827, the heart of the Zulu Kingdom was struck by a blow more piercing than any spear. Nondi, the mother who had carried Shaka through hardship, who had shielded him in exile and fueled his rise, closed her eyes to the world. To Shaka, this was not just the loss of a parent, it was the falling of the sun itself. His grief was like a storm that darkened the skies of the kingdom. In his sorrow, he commanded a mourning so vast that it touched every soul under his rule. Fields lay unplanted, for no seed was to be sown in that season of sorrow. Cows were forbidden to bear calves, and women were told not to bring new life into a world that had just lost a queen mother. Songs of lament rose day and night, echoing across the valleys like a river of mourning. But grief sharpened into severity. Shaka's decisions, born from pain, seemed heavy to his people. The restrictions he imposed pressed upon daily life, and what was meant to honor his mother began to burden the living. Whispers grew in the homesteads, carried by the wind, whispers of unease, of a king whose grief had become a chain around the necks of his people. Beneath the polished shields of the regiments and the proud dances of the warriors, a quiet fracture had begun to spread. By 1828, the storm that had carried Shaka to greatness now circled back upon him. His grief, his unyielding commands, and the growing strain of his rule had left cracks in the walls of loyalty. Within those shadows, ambition took root. Two of his half-brothers, Dingain and Mlangana, once bound to him by blood, began to weave a web of betrayal. The conspiracy was born in whispers and sealed in silence. They saw in Shaka's sorrow and severity an opening, a chance to seize the throne of the Zulu. Around them gathered men weary of mourning, men uneasy with the weight of Shaka's decrees, men who believed that change must come, even if it came through blood. On a fateful day, as Shaka stood near his kraal, the conspirators struck. There was no battlefield, no grand formation, only daggers in the shadows of kinship. The great king, whose spear had broken countless foes, was brought down not by an enemy across the hills, but by the hands of those closest to him. It was said he fell with disbelief, the roar of a lion silenced by the very pride he had raised. His death marked the end of an era, yet the Zulu Kingdom did not collapse. Power shifted swiftly. Dingain and Mlangana seized the throne, and the regiments bent their heads to a new command. The rhythm of the nation continued, though the heart that had driven it now lay still. Thus, Shaka's life ended not in the blaze of battle but in the quiet treachery of family. Yet even in death, his presence lingered. For the kingdom he had built did not vanish, it endured, reshaped by those who followed, but forever standing on the foundation he had laid. The man was gone, but the shadow of his greatness stretched far beyond his grave.